There's a story we keep telling ourselves about great artists that they were broken, that they suffered, that without the darkness, the masterpiece would never have existed. We point to Van Gogh's letters, to Frida Kahlo's broken spine, to Kurt Cobain's journals, to Chester Bennington's voice, the voice which could somehow hold the weight of something most of us couldn't even name, let alone carry. And somewhere in that telling, we feel many things at once. Two of those being moved because the art genuinely touches us, and relieved because we've just given ourselves a reason not to try. If great art requires that kind of pain and I haven't suffered enough, then I'm not qualified. And if that greatness is not possible through me, then why even bother? It's a neat exit, quite logical, and most people take it without even noticing that they have taken it. So today I want to ask the question properly, not as a romanticized idea, not as a motivational poster, but as something I have to sit with myself for much longer than I expected and more honestly than I was comfortable. Does pain and suffering alone create great art? Short answer is no. But the longer answer is where it gets interesting, and it begins, for me, with a band that I depended on for years before I understood why. If you've grown up listening to Linkin Park, you might already know what I mean when I say that their music doesn't just play in the background, it holds something. There's a line that people say about Chester, the man who saved millions, but millions could not save one man. When I first heard that, I felt it land somewhere specific, and along with the sad fact came a question I didn't yet know how to ask. Because Chester had everything the myth says about what should protect you. He had fans who treated his voice like a lifeline. He had a family. He had friends. And more than that, he had a legacy that had already changed the emotional vocabulary of an entire generation. He had added value to the world, and yet the worst that could have happened happened. So is the myth wrong, or have we been misreading the story entirely? I think it's both. Let me try to explain what I think pain actually does, because this is where the conversation usually gets flattened into something that it isn't. Pain is intense, and even in that, high level of intensity is rare. Most of our days are lived somewhere in the middle, comfortable enough to not fully pay attention, and uncomfortable enough to not fully rest. But pain breaks that. It demands your full presence. It refuses to be ignored. And here's what I've noticed: when you stay with an intense emotion, really stay with it, rather than immediately reaching for the nearest distraction, a shift happens. The intensity itself starts to open doors, not just to more pain, but to the full range of what it means to feel something, to joy, to frustration that has a real texture, to a kind of clarity that comfort can never quite deliver, to emotions you didn't know you were carrying. Pain, in this sense, is not the fuel, it is the opening. But, and this is the part most people miss, what pain actually does at its deepest is that it takes away the perception you once held, the narrative about the experience, the story you told about yourself, the right way to look at it. And in that moment of losing your old story, a choice appears. You can run from it, find a new distraction, a new comfort, a new way to avoid the question, or you can ask, what else is there? What does it actually mean? And out of that curiosity, not out of the suffering itself, but out of the willingness to stay with the question, an artist is born. For a long time, I depended on Linkin Park, not casually, but genuinely depended on them. In the way you depend on something or someone when you don't quite have the words for what you're feeling, but someone else does. Listening to their music was comfort, real comfort, the kind that doesn't ask questions. And then something changed. My friend sent me a text. Did you get the news? No, what news? I looked it up and it had really happened. Chester Bennington, Linkin Park vocalist, took his own life. I searched for every news I could find to make sense out of that headline, but it was not to be. A few months after his death, I was going through a difficult period, career rejections accompanied by a deeper sense of being stuck and feeling helpless. And I returned to that music the way I always had, expecting it to hold me. It didn't, because the change that needed to happen has already happened. And when I say it stopped working, I don't mean it became sad. I mean it became insufficient. Whatever I was carrying had grown past the shape of that comfort. The illusion could no longer contain it. My distraction refused me. And I believe, looking back, that's exactly what their music had always been asking from me. Not to keep staying in the pain, but to stay long enough to find out what was on the other side and then expand the exploration. His own life was a painful reminder that even the person doing the asking doesn't always find the answer, but the asking still mattered. It reached people, it still opened possibilities for others. And for me, what it eventually opened, not overnight, not even within a year, but gradually and quietly, without me being fully aware of it, was the need to make something myself. Creativity, photography, didn't arrive as an answer. It arrived as the only option left when everything else had stopped being enough. The pain wasn't the point, the insufficiency was the point. The moment when someone else's expression, however beautiful, however honest, could no longer hold what I needed to express. That's when I had to become creative myself. Now, here is where I want to push back on something. We have built an entire mythology around the suffering artist, and this mythology does two things: one that feels true, and the one that is quietly harmful. What feels true is that there is something in the depth of painful experience that can give art the weight, not always and not automatically, but there is a real connection between having felt something deeply and being able to express something that moves people. What is harmful is that we have taken that connection and turned it into a gatekeeping mechanism. Real art requires real suffering, and if you haven't suffered enough, you haven't earned the right to create something important. This is an exit strategy, because if suffering alone were the answer, then every person who has ever lived through something difficult would be a great artist. And clearly, that isn't true. Pain by itself is just pain. What determines whether it becomes something else is what you do with the possibility it creates. There is also another layer to this, one that is less comfortable to say out loud. The suffering artist myth is useful for selling things. A narrative of pain attached to a painting increases its perceived value. A backstory of struggle makes the music feel more earned. And I've seen this in photography also. People using complex language and constructed narratives to assign depth to a work that doesn't actually have it, justifying laziness or lack of effort by performing a version of suffering that the work itself doesn't carry. The context adds meanings, yes, that's real, but when the suffering becomes the product itself, when we assign value to the pain rather than to the expression, we have confused the opening with the destination. And this confusion has kept too many people silent. I used to say it myself: art cannot be created without pain. I said it before I understood what I meant by it, before I had sat with it long enough to find out if it was actually true. It wasn't, not in the way that I was using it at least. It was a statement I reached for before I was ready to make anything myself. There is one more thing I want to add to the conversation. Does knowing the backstory behind a piece of art change how we experience it? I think about a photograph by Eugene Smith, Tomoko and her mother in the bath. Looking at it the first time, you can see that something is wrong, something is not ordinary. A mother holding her child in water, a tenderness that has weight to it. But knowing the backstory, that Tomoko had Minamata disease, a condition caused by mercury poisoning dumped into the water by a chemical company in Japan, that this photograph helped expose one of the worst industrial disasters in history, that it was taken at a great personal cost and used to change the outcome of an entire community. Suddenly, the photograph is not just a photograph, it is the evidence, a witness. It is the proof that someone was present in a moment of suffering and chose to not look away. That's what the backstory does. It doesn't create the depth was already there, but the backstory reveals how it got there. It confirms what you felt when you looked at it was earned, was real. It was connected to something that actually happened to an actual person. And the same is true for Chester's voice. Someone who has never been through anything difficult might hear Linkin Park and say, "Why would you listen to this when you are already upset?" But someone who has stayed with something, who has sat in the specific loneliness of feeling like no one could possibly understand, hears the same music and feels something else entirely. Relief. The relief that someone else has named something you couldn't name yourself. And the sense of, I'm not the only one dealing with this, trying to survive this. That's what great art actually does. Not a performance of suffering, but express the part of experience that was too large or too quiet or too strange to fit into any ordinary language. And that you can't fake. No matter how carefully you construct the backstory, no matter how much you perform the myth, either it was felt or it wasn't. And an audience, given enough time and attention, will always be able to tell the difference. So, if not suffering, then what? I keep coming back to this one word, depth. Not pain specifically, but the willingness to go deep enough into any experience so that you reach the place where language fails, where the ordinary ways of communicating can no longer hold what you are trying to say. That's where art begins. Pain can take you there, but so can wonder, so can love that doesn't dissolve, or a moment of such specific beauty that no existing word feel adequate enough to describe it. And what photography has taught me, not in theory but in practice, is this. The photographs that feel like something are almost never the ones I planned. They are the ones where I was paying attention to something I couldn't name, where I pressed the shutter not because I knew what I was capturing, but because something was happening and I didn't want to look away from it. This requires that you've trained yourself not to flinch, and often, more often than we admit, what trains you not to flinch is having stayed with something difficult long enough that you've stopped being afraid of what you might find. That is the real gift of painful experience, not suffering as a prerequisite, but depth as a practice. And difficult experiences, if you stay with them rather than escaping, teach you how to go deep. So, back to the question, does pain and suffering create great art? Not on its own. Pain that is only performed, only narrated, used as a badge, produces self pity and superficiality dressed as a deep expression. But the pain that is stayed with, processed, questioned, and eventually found its way into a form that couldn't have existed any other way, that can produce something real. Chester's voice reached people not just because he suffered, but because he stayed with it long enough to find words for it. And in finding words, or screams, or silence, or those specific break in a melody, he gave other people a way to stay with their own. And that's what art does at its best. It doesn't ask you to suffer, it asks you to stay. And here's what I want to leave you with. You don't have to wait for suffering to justify your creativity. You don't have to earn the right to make something by first having been broken enough. What you need is not more pain. What you need is willingness to stay with what you already feel, to go deep enough into your own experience, whatever that experience is, that you reach the place where language runs out, and then you find the form for what lives there. That's it. That's all art is. The rest, the mythology, the tortured genius, the romanticism of suffering, is just a story we tell to avoid starting. Start anyway. If you like this opinion, then like, subscribe, and share this with your community. And write down in comments about your personal experience to add to this narrative. Also, check out more related videos on this playlist. And until next time.